Again, welcome to everyone who's joining us this afternoon for this panel on Jewish and queer experiences and perspectives on the current conflict in the Ukraine. My name is Simon Doubleday. I teach in the history departments here at Hofstra University. Some of you are in my class, many of you are not. I actually focus in medieval history, but I've organized a class, in fact, on the Ukraine. It was something we did at the last minute, confronted with this enormous catastrophe. We in the history department felt it was essential to organize a course that allowed students to have a forum in which to learn and discuss their responses to this crisis. And it's my pleasure today to introduce, we have two speakers today. I think I'll introduce them in a second consecutively. So first I'm going to introduce Sophia Sobko, who is a queer Soviet Jewish cultural organizer, scholar, educator, and artist, born in Moscow and now living in Oakland, California. Sophia is currently a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, where she's completing her dissertation on Soviet Ashkenazi Jewish negotiations of racial assimilation in the US. And I should say, thank you, Sophia, for interrupting what I know is an extraordinarily busy stage in your professional career. I know you were anxious about, understandably anxious about finishing the thesis, but you've joined us anyway, and we very much appreciate that. Sophia is the founder and stewarding member of the Kolektiv Goluboy Vagon and a founding artist with Krivoy Kolektiv. And I believe if she hasn't already done so, she will be placing the links to those organizations in the chat. Before I hand the floor over completely to Sophia, might I also say that anyone with questions after the talks, please post them in the chat. Because we're relatively short of time and the 55 minutes goes very fast, what I'll do is to select some of the questions from the chat and ask the speakers directly, but do feel free to post your questions in the chat. Questions more than comments, I think, would be appreciated. But with that having been said, let me now hand the floor over to Sophia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Simon and Santiago, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I'm going to time myself and see how much I can cover in 20 minutes. And I'm also grateful to Santiago for sharing my slides, which you're welcome to do now. And I'll just be asking him to switch slides throughout. So some of my bio was already repeated, but I really wanted to start by saying how I enter this topic and this conversation. I'm an immigrant myself. Like was explained, I'm studying Soviet Ashkenazi Jewish immigration, which is really like 7 years of me trying to locate myself in the history of all of these empires. And I'm also a cultural organizer for other queer immigrants. And I have to say what I'm not an expert on Ukrainian history. And I think it's important to say I'm also not in close relationship with LGBTQ organizers or queer people or Jewish people who are currently in Ukraine or who were in Ukraine at the start of the crisis. My work is really situated here, but of course it's a transnational project. So because of that, I have certain connections and I think insights that I'll try to share. So I was born in the former Soviet Union in Moscow. I moved to the US at the age of 5 in 1991. It was 6 months before the Soviet Union fell. And we came on a Jewish refugee visa, which there's a very long story behind that in a month when I finish my dissertation will be in there. My mom is from Moscow. My dad is from Sevastopol, Crimea, occupied Crimea, though he was born in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. And that was because my grandmother, my babushka, was displaced in World War II. And I say this just because it does give you a sense of some of the like the 3 layers of displacement just in 3 generations and survival and great deal of privilege, I think, that has gotten me to here. So on the next slide, I just wanted to also share that 3 out of 4 of my grandparents, all of whom were Jewish, were born in Ukraine. Of course, it was known as the USSR then. And I wanted to just briefly show on the left side this map of the Pale of Settlement. And for those of you who are not familiar with Eastern European Jewish history, during the Russian Empire, throughout the 1800s, this is where Ashkenazi Jews were restricted to live and work. And so many people who identify as Eastern European Jews trace their ancestry back to here. And on the right side, you see that when Russia attacked, one of the first things that my sibling did, they sent me this picture, is they mapped, they looked at where the attacks were happening, and they mapped where our three grandparents were from. So outside of Kiev, Kharkov and Odessa. And then you can see, my dad was raised in Crimea, which is occupied by Russia currently. So this is very close, and at the same time, it's very distant, because I'm speaking to this from a lot of protections here in the US. And so, this is both directly connected to the theorizations I do of trying to locate Jews in the Soviet Empire, in the Russian Empire before that, and in the US Empire, and understand the connections between all these. And then in the next slide, you'll see that I also steward Kolektiv Goluboy Vagon. So this is a group of queer and gender marginalized Soviet Jewish immigrants who all live in the US and Canada. And there's about 50 of us right now. And we do a lot of cultural and political organizing for what we're calling collective liberation. So it's anti-imperialist and decolonial work based in our own histories. And in this group, there are many people, though I was born in Moscow, there are many people who were born in Ukraine, who lived there as children, and whose family and friends have either recently fled or are there and trapped, or have been killed in the last month and a half. I'm actually one of the people who has a little bit more distance because my family's in Russia. Many people have folks in both countries. So what we're seeing is the political line that divides them is breaking families apart. It's bringing some closer together. And as many of you have heard or are living, there's so much overlap in these cultures and languages. In the next slide, I want to say, again, my own family's in Russia. These are actually my grandparents on the left who have since passed away. And, that's very emotional, thinking through had they been living through this after all they've already been living through, what it would have been like for them. But my family in Moscow, some are staying, some have actually left as the country is getting increasingly isolated. But one of my best friends in the group, Luba, she's been my closest contact to what's going on in Ukraine. And I'll be speaking more about this today. Her elderly aunt and uncle, who you see here, this is actually an old picture from when she visited maybe a decade ago. They're actually trapped in Odessa right now because due to health reasons, they can't leave. And so when Russia started these attacks, we began a fundraiser to raise money for her family and for others who can't flee. So on the next slide, I wanted to share a little bit of just how, from my particular positionality and those that we share in the collective, what's been coming up, and kind of what are the insights that we have without recentering ourselves, right? Because actually one thing that we're feeling is how the distance we did feel has somewhat collapsed. So I had a conversation with my dad 2 days ago where I actually thanked him for the first time for immigrating, because I'm feeling my own safety. And that's a very complicated thing for me to say, because I've always been very critical of the US, and I continue to be. And I couldn't understand, I think, in my body, why we came here. I really regretted that rupture that I had with my family and the place I was from. But what I'm feeling now is, that would be me and Luba now fleeing either bombs or a place that feels like it has no future. And so I shared that with my dad, and he cried. And I'm holding that as I also hold all of my critiques of the US, both the violences that happen internally here and externally. So that's one of the things I wanted to share, is that it's been painful to feel so close to this, as we're also holding a lot of the political arguments and ideological ways that this attack both is being used and is what it's really revealing, which again, that is our work in the Kolektiv, that is my academic work, but there's this particular way it's painful to hold both at once, as Luba's aunt and uncle are literally hiding in a basement, and she often cannot get through to them. But I pulled these headlines for you just to show you what are some of the headlines that have really struck a chord with me and stayed with me. And a lot of it revolves around the characterization of Ukraine just as blanketly white and European. And this is happening both on the right and on the left. And what's been particularly painful and infuriating, of course, is to see Ukrainians who are white or read as white welcomed and supported when Syrians and Afghanis were mistreated, dehumanized, or turned away. So that's the headline that you see from Hungary. Of course, in Germany, Germany's accepted many refugees from the Middle East, but still it's happening. People are housing people in their own homes because they're saying they're like us. And then similarly with, the way that Palestinians are not supported for sovereignty efforts, and then Ukrainians are. Again, not to say the situations are completely analogous, but these are the things that are speaking to me. And at the same time, I'm noticing how there's this, I don't know if it's an American imagined, I'm gonna call it US imagined because that's the place I work from, but pan-European imagined whiteness. And that's a term from Claudia Sadowski-Smith's 2017 book, The New Immigrant Whiteness. But what I'm feeling is the way that this is erasing the histories of groups who are and have been racially othered in some way in this region. So I'm thinking of Tatars, I'm thinking of Jews, not only Ashkenazi, but Krimchaks and Karaites in Crimea. I'm thinking of Roma. We see on the right side, many of you, I'm sure, heard in the news about African students or refugees who had already been displaced and resettled, not getting the same treatment. So again, there's overlap where these headlines are bringing important analyses to light, but I think as a scholar and as someone who lives this, what it often feels like is it is maybe a liberal American imagination or an imagination of whiteness that is blanketly being put on this region. And there's a lot that this obscures, right? So particularly for Jews, my elders, my grandparents had survived World War II, Nazi mass killings, which are often not taught in the US curriculum, right? We learn about concentration camps, but not about Baba Yar. Stalinism, famine, the fall of the USSR. It's so painful to imagine these elders continue to experience this violence. The last thing is this gaze also erases the power dynamics that are internal to Europe. So earlier this year, I presented on whiteness at a conference that was situated in Europe. And the phrase that was being used was peripheral whiteness. And the idea that Eastern Europe is both inside and outside of Europe. So I say all this just to complicate some of the analyses that we're seeing, to say that the people in Ukraine are not homogenous. My family would have never been considered Ukrainians. They would have never described themselves that way. They spoke Russian, they spoke Ukrainian, they spoke Yiddish, but they would have been considered Jews, and that was marked on their passport. Similarly, there's Tatars, there's Roma, who often don't even have documents. So this is something I'm going to continue learning about, and if I have a second, I'll drop in the chat also a talk that is going to be on this topic. But I wanted to say, ultimately, Eastern Europe has not fully been considered European, actually, by the West. And I'm thinking of Santiago Slabodsky's work, who's our next speaker and personal hero and teacher for me, Madina Plastanova's work. But in relation to the global South, it is often rendered more civilized. And so I think that's what I'm seeing appear in how white and European perceived refugees are being treated, and how sovereignty and self-defense are being praised, even as this is so important in Ukraine. And I feel it in my body in a way I haven't before. So on the next slide, Maybe a little bit more personal. I wanted to speak briefly about the grief of rupture. And when I was preparing this talk, my friend Luba reminded me how important this is to share, that in this group, me and other immigrants, and I think probably most immigrants and refugees know firsthand the impacts of the rupture that occurs during immigration, and from language, from grandparents. I can't see their graves. I can't go to my parents' favorite places, from food, from ways of not knowing, and the way that immigrants and refugees, by virtue of their displacement, become implicated in larger imperial and colonial projects. And this is really something that in the Kolektiv we're working to learn together. I think this is a collective project. I think everybody should be learning their history in this way. If you're located in the US, if you're not indigenous to here, are you a descendant of enslaved people? Are you a descendant of immigrants? How did you get to come here? What were the geopolitical kind of influences? These are the questions I'm asking. But I'm also asking questions about the intergenerational trauma that's being passed down and the way that the ruptures and the displacement facilitate assimilation into the project of settler colonialism and of empire. And we're just imagining in the Kolektiv this for the 4.5 million Ukrainians who have fled, right? Are they going to be resettled in Israel, occupied Palestine? Are they coming here? Are they going to a number of countries in Eastern Europe that, don't have strong LGBTQ support records? And so they're actually going to places that are going to be violent. And how are they going to be positioned there with all this trauma? We also know the impacts that war has on generations and the grief that this will continue to happen. And this is one of the first things my mom said to me. She called me when Russia attacked and she said, I don't regret that I brought you here. She doesn't have the same analysis of the US as I do, but she said, I don't regret it. And then she said, this is so horrifying. This is going to impact people for generations. And of course, none of this is solely applicable to just wars where, quote, white or European people are. This is true everywhere. I think it's just, for me, I've been privileged enough that I haven't felt that in the same way, even as I'm involved in many liberation efforts around the world. And I feel responsible to understand the cultural and political implications. So yeah, I guess to conclude, I want to say a couple of things. One is just to pose this question that I took from Judith Butler, which is whose lives are grievable, who's worthy of self-defense and sovereignty. I'm continuing to understand the history of these empires and how they're connected. And I also am trying to stay with the immediacy of the violence that people are suffering. I can't personally look at the photographs, but on the next slide, Santiago will show you, me and Luba have been organizing a fundraiser for the last month and a half. It feels like something tangible we can do. I'll drop the link in the chat, but please, if you have means to give, we're continuing to raise money. And we have direct connections via the people in the Kolektiv to organizers in Ukraine. So your donations will go almost immediately to people who are helping people get shelter, food, medicine. And it's also complicated, right? So I think after we raised $10,000 overnight, I had never raised so much money in my life. And I really had to sit with how I was able to mobilize funds so quickly for this particular group. And so what Luba and I decided is to direct 50% of the funds to war relief efforts in the global south. And so we're kind of leveraging the attention to Ukraine, both to use it for Ukraine and for similar crises, because, all people are deserving of safety and support. And we've gotten pushback on that from some people. We've also gotten support. Sometimes the pushback is in our own families, which is particularly painful, but that's why we have each other to talk through it. And we recently distributed some money to Mecca, which is doing work in Gaza. So please donate. We just keep upping our goals. So right now we're at 40,000 and we're seeing that this is one of the most helpful material things we could do. And I know I didn't explicitly speak about LGBTQ populations. Santiago, can you show the next slide? This is an artwork that I created with a couple of friends. Actually, strangely, we created in Hungary, but I know I didn't speak too much about LGBTQ populations explicitly, and I'm basically out of time. But I want to say we're also distributing funds to LGBTQ populations. Something to educate yourself if you don't know about is what trans people are experiencing, because they may not have, by virtue of their documents, either having changed their gender or not. Trans women, their documents might say male and they're being conscripted. Trans men may be being conscripted. So there is so much incredible organizing work that is being done by so many organizations. And I would be happy to send some out maybe via email to people who registered. So that is something I'm following, and I'm available if you want to contact me and hear more about it. And then just in terms of, I didn't want to go too deep into the theory or the politics of it, but I think one way I'm understanding this, especially as a queer person who's, has the safety of being a white queer person in the US, having been born in Russia, is the way that Putin is really using LGBTQ people in a culture war that's framing the West against the East, right? So queerness, homosexuality is a Western decadent export, right? And Putin is protecting the traditional ways of life in Russia. And in Ukraine, it was similar with some more protection, a little bit more protection under the last administration or the current one. So I'm continuing to learn all about this. I don't want to end on Putin, but I have to end. So I really encourage you all to just give to our fundraiser or support in other ways that you can. And then, in terms of the pedagogical work, I'm an educator. So continue to learn about your own family history, locate yourself in relation to these empires, know the US is not innocent and Russia is just the evil, the barbaric evil of the world, as I'm sure Santiago will tell you more about. And also, let's stay with the grievability of all lives. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for a talk that was simultaneously, of course, very thoughtful and reflective, and also very emotional and personal. Thank you very much for that, and I'm sure there'll be many questions. If you would like to begin posting them, all of you who are present, if you'd like to, again, post your questions in the chat, feel free to ask any questions for Sophia there, to write them down there. And then, of course, I will be happy to raise them when we get to the Q&A session after Professor Slabodsky's talk. Santiago Slabodsky, already introduced as a personal intellectual hero, I've forgotten the precise terminology, but well-deserved, holds the Florence and Robert Kaufman Chair in Jewish Studies in the Department of Religion here at Hofstra University. In his research, he explores intercultural encounters between Jewish and global South social theories and political movements. And he served as a visiting professor in institutions in a wide variety of countries, including Spain, Macedonia, the Netherlands, Canada, Costa Rica, and his native Argentina. His teaching areas include Jewish thought and culture, religion and politics, interreligious conversations, Jewish-Muslim dialogue, post-colonial studies, critical theories of religion, and race and globalization. And I know some of the students present have already taken classes with him. Hopefully those of you that haven't will have the opportunity in the near future. Santiago, the floor is yours.
Now I am muted, so thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank everyone who has made this possible. It's a long list, so I can name everyone, but especially to Someone of Life for actually making this happen at the Cultural Center, History, Religion, European Studies, Jewish Studies, and a special thanks from Sophia Sobko, who is doing an incredible work connecting really in the way we think and we feel in the same way in order to actually engage with this struggle, and also for accepting our invitation when she is very, very close to finish her dissertation. So I want to start exactly where what I would call very, very soon Dr. Sobko. I'm saying very, very soon because I am part of her committee and I know it's going to go very well. And you should be waiting because her book is coming very soon and it's going to be a landmark. But she's told us a little bit about the violence that we are presenting there is real. And we need an urgent confrontation. So people are actually dying and people are finding the need of refuge for geopolitical pressure we need to confront. So what we want to talk, I want to talk today with you is a little bit about these geopolitical projects and how we can challenge them. The conclusion I'm going to arrive at the end is that what we are going to be seeing is the permanent use of a narrative about Holocaust history and Holocaust memory that in this clay is what I would call a misleading clarity, where we are posing very well, as soon to be Dr. Sobko was saying before, people who are liberators are people who are oppressors. But in this case in particular, it forces us to choose one block or the other, limiting our possibilities and give us a misleading impression of what is actually at stake. So I want to start with two pictures that I took from the readings that the students of this class of Dr. Doubleday are actually exploring. On one side, you have a narrative coming from the West, so saying that Putin and Russia are weaponizing the memory of the Holocaust. And on the other hand, talk a little bit about how Ukraine Jewish president has made his peace with neo-Nazi paramilitaries, especially in the eastern side of the Ukraine. So what I'm going to argue here is that both sides are using histories and memories of the World War II, and especially the Holocaust, in order to actually show themselves being on the right side of history. One way to analyze this, and I think it's very helpful if someone wants to do it, is to say who is right and who is wrong. Okay, and it's very helpful to do it, but this is not what I am going to be doing today. Not because I don't think that there is one side that is more right than the other, I do believe there is, but because I want to explore something else. I don't want to explore how these two sides are different, but actually what these two sides have in common. What I'm going to say is that the similarity is the mobilization of Holocaust history and memory as a way of getting support for a geopolitical cause. This gives us a clarity. One side is liberator and just, the other side is the oppressor or criminal or the barbaric, as soon to be Dr. Sobko said, and the other is civilization. And this might not be the full story. So what is the geopolitical situation happening right now? This is not inclusive of all the possibilities, but at least it's a way of understanding this. Starting in the Cold War, we are going to see that there are geopolitical blocs fighting for dominance of the world through what we call proxy wars. Ukraine's attempt to join NATO or the West of the European Union or the side of civilization, which has been built, especially in NATO, as an anti-Soviet alliance, on the one hand, and on the other hand is the Russian defense of its spheres of influence. So we need to differentiate between the two blocks that they represent two imperial projects. One is the Western project that presents itself as anti-Soviet or anti-Eastern, anti-barbaric, anti-Russian, and the other side that is Russia, as before was the Soviet Union, and before was Tsarism, declaring themselves as the third Rome or the sphere of influence over all Eastern Europe. So I want to differentiate between what is the rhetoric of these two blocks, that for lack of better terms, I would call it the Western and the Eastern, even though they are not precisely this, and the use of discourse by the people in context who are actually suffering geopolitics in play. So here is the question is how this Holocaust memory is being used. We are going to see that currently there is a political mobilization of the Holocaust as a template to interpret everything. So very different situations in the US in the last years, from the anti-vaccine movement to the anti-Muslim ban of Trump to the concentration camps in the US-Mexico border. All of them have mobilized certain kind of Holocaust memory and history. Now, the question I want to ask, if there is a right or wrong way to mobilize Holocaust history and memory, it's about the right or wrong, it's about truth, it's about the ultimate goal, it's about who enunciates it. I want to ask, what is the changing role of Jewish history and what Jewish history can tell us about the geopolitical changes and the blocks, the East and West constitution? Mostly, I am interpreting that as soon to be Dr. Sobko said before, Jews were racialized in the Eastern Europe, And before the 1950s, they were also racialized in the US itself. But now the idea of the Jew presents itself as the forefront of both geopolitical projects. I want to ask, what is the difference between Jewish action and action of somehow the Jew? And I want to analyze the lingering anti-Semitism, not only from friends, I'm sorry, not only from enemies, but also from friends, and how the idea of the Jew is being used. And finally, something that soon to be Dr. Sobko actually analyzed very well in her dissertation is how these discourse of the Holocaust affect the way we interpret settler colonialism or racism in the US, Israel-Palestine, immigrations of Muslims into Europe, and others. So the question is how the Holocaust has been mobilized. The conception of the Holocaust as a template to start interpreting virtually the whole world started legally, I would call at least largely legally in 1948 with the UN definition of prevention of genocide. At the same time, beyond the legal framework, what is the lesson of the Holocaust and how to apply the Holocaust has always been subject of discussions. So let me tell you some of these discussions that have been from the 1950s until today. Is the lesson of the Holocaust never again to Jews, or is the lesson of the Holocaust never again to anyone? Is the lesson of the Holocaust presenting a very clear idea that some people are always liberators, or are always victims, or are always oppressors and always evil? The third, is the Holocaust unique, or is the Holocaust related with other genocides? These are the questions that people in different parts of the world have mobilized to interpret the Holocaust. These versions, the versions that emerge in central locations, are going to have much more weight. Here, I am going to argue that it is not wrong or right to mobilize the Holocaust. This is what we do with memories. We do mobilize memories for political reasons. But I want to argue here is we want to think about the ethics of mobilization. Not so much about what is right or wrong about the uses of the Holocaust, but how it is used, by whom it is used, and why. So how the Holocaust has been mobilized. So for example, in the 50s and 60s, some Jewish survivors of the Holocaust engaged supporting the Algerian anti-colonial struggles using the memory of the Holocaust. A few years later, in the middle of the student uprising known as May 1968, I will call it the left wing or the revolutionaries, young French, and the unions actually came to the street calling themselves "We are all Jews," when there was an exclusion of a stateless Jewish leader from entering France after he left for Germany for a propaganda intrigue. In the 60s and 80s, the idea of the Holocaust has been mobilized in order to reckon about Christian anti-Semitism and constructing an idea of the Judeo-Christian tradition in the US, or the European community in Europe, including Jews, that was leaving behind anti-Semitism. In my homeland in Latin America, the Holocaust has been used as a template in order to judge US-backed dictatorships in the 1980s. But at the same time, the Holocaust has been used for other reasons. For example, in the 2000s, have been used to challenge and censor the adaptation of Middle Eastern and North African immigrants in France and Germany. In the 50s and on, has been used to dismantle US Jewish revolutionaries in order to reify a white black line in the US that not only soon to be Dr. Sobko talk about, but also a student who is now in the audience, Melissa Brownstein, is writing a wonderful honor thesis in Jewish studies about this particular issue right now. And in the 1960s, for example, Israel has mobilized it in order to gain Jewish and Western support for the state. And for some people, this has been a defense against anti-Semitism, but also for others, as soon to be Dr. Sobko was saying, was to naturalize the foreignness of Palestinians. So I want to analyze with you a little bit, and I think this is my last slide, a little bit about the uses and abuses of the Holocaust. The memory of the Holocaust has always been mobilized. And this is not so much about historical accuracy, even though historical accuracy is important. We are doing this in the Department of History, and as such, historical accuracy is important, but it's not the only thing in play. This is about the discursive and political role that this mobilization of the Holocaust happened. So by mobilizing the Holocaust, we guarantee that the world is going to be seen in a binary terms between a liberator on the one hand and a liberator and victim on the one hand, and an oppressive or evil or barbaric on the other. Sometimes, however, the two sides share more than we think. And this idea of the binary closes up the options that you need to be with Russia or you need to be with the West. And there is no other possibility than to defend one imperial project. Sometimes the big block of powers use Holocaust memory, and actually people who are suffering are being forced to choose between one side or the other. What they see as the totalitarianism of Russia and what they see as the assimilationism to the West of Europe and the US. These are, however, two blocks of power that they are trying to assert themselves and call for themselves the right to speak for the Holocaust. And I am going to question that these are the only two options. So I want to interrogate with all of you the ethics of big power blocks mobilizing Holocaust history. Not because I don't think Holocaust history should be mobilized. For example, I think when Holocaust history and memory has been mobilized in order to talk about the conditions of concentration camps in the border, US-Mexico border, is a right way of mobilization. I think what is being used in order to oppose the Trump anti-Muslim ban is a right way of doing it. So there are ways of mobilizing the Holocaust that is not going to emerge from big power blocks, but is going to emerge from grassroots organizations who are actually fighting against injustice. So the fact it is true that there is absolutely no reason for us to downplay that this is about Russian imperialist ambitions. This has a long history and there is absolutely no reason to deny this. But the fact that we are censoring or we are trying to censor what Putin is doing on one hand, that doesn't mean we need to actually support the other side, which present the West as innocent and altruistic. We know, as soon-to-be Dr. Sobko said, or I will just call it Dr. Sobko because very soon it's going to happen, that there is a consequences of the taking of refugees in terms of the geopolitics of what is happening in that place, because of how the lines, the color lines, are being presented in the world. So I am all in favor of taking refugees, but I'm going to say is the West is not as innocent and as altruistic as we think it is. And by saying this, that doesn't mean one is a Russian supporter, but I am going to interrogate that the two blocks can monopolize the history of the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust, and we need to choose between one and the other. So the two blocks are not equal. If you see probably the majority of Ukrainians, especially after the almost revolution that happened 3 years ago and was cut by COVID, they are going to support a westernization of the country. And as such, they had a right to self-determination as far as they respect also their minorities, including the Russian minority. Now, to support the Ukrainian struggle, that doesn't mean to support the international interest in the Ukrainian struggle. And I want to make this clear. It is not the same thing supporting the Ukrainian struggle than to support one bloc or the other who had other interests in mind. So what I want to do with all of you today is to think a little bit about not question how the Holocaust and Jews are being mobilized politically. All history and all memory is up for grabs in order to be mobilized. My question is, who is doing and for what? And to what extent, when we see two political blocs, two powerful political blocs, who have been until very recently maintaining multiple proxy wars around the world and maintaining the war under the threat of an atomic or nuclear war for a very long time, what happened when those major political blocs think themselves as altruistic, free, or pure? what Sophia Sobko was telling us before is Russia thinks itself as altruistic, free and pure, saying we want to preserve the traditional ways, we want to stop Western decadence. The West presents itself as free, as the reign of democracy, extending freedom to the world. But I want to see that under the disguise of this altruistic project, there is a political imperial project. And I want to say that I do support strongly the political mobilization of the Holocaust, but I want to interrogate the ethics when major political blocs are actually using them. So I thank everyone for your patience. Thank you for tolerating my accent, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Slabodsky, Santiago. A fascinating and very provocative talk. And I again thank Sophia for her contribution. And of course, I now welcome any questions in the chat from students, from other members of the audience. And I'll be happy to articulate those questions to the speakers. Maybe I can just get the ball rolling a little bit by asking Sophia a straightforward question, perhaps it's more complicated than I think, but whether you could just talk a little bit about the situation, the status, the oppression of LGBTQ people in Ukraine or in Russia. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. I know that's something I didn't have so much time to talk about despite the title of our talk. So again, not an expert, but I've been trying to learn about this for a long time. My understanding is, there's pre-war Ukraine, right? And then there's what's happening right now. So pre-war Ukraine, some similarities with Russia. LGBTQ couples are not allowed to marry or adopt. Single LGBT identifying people can adopt. Pre-war Ukraine, there's some recognition of anti-LGBT hate crimes, some legal protections, gender reassignment was allowed, some public organizing. If you look up Ukraine Pride Parade, there's images. In Russia, there was a lot more persecution, at least officially, right? Because there are also always all kind of groups and hate crimes that are causing violence to LGBT people. And like I said earlier, in Russia, gender reassignment only following a surgery. But, now I was reading articles about prominent LGBT activists from Ukraine, and they're saying if they stay, they either fled, because we know that when there is military violence and turmoil, we know that assaults are on the rise, right, against women, against LGBT people. So it's a very dangerous situation, even separate from the the possibility of getting conscripted into the military. So many people who were able to have fled, many with the help of LGBT organizations, both in Ukraine and abroad, organizing via Telegram channels. And then I was reading, some very prominent activists who stayed, and they are, distributing supplies, or they're really involved in the self-defense efforts there. So that's a little bit of what I know. I wanted to plug the organization, New York City-based organization, Rusa LGBT, RUSA LGBT. I think they have many more connections to LGBT people in Ukraine today than I do, or than the Kolektiv necessarily does. But like I said, I think particularly precarious for trans people ages 18 to 60 who are at threat of being conscripted. Also things, sometimes cisgender people don't think about, like access to medicine or access to hormones. Just a really dangerous, precarious situation. But again, I'm speaking based on interviews I've heard with people and articles I've read.
Thank you. And just to introduce a question from a student at this point, forgive me if you did already address this. I was being a little bit distracted by the sudden flurry of questions appearing here, but are LGBTQ people being prevented from fleeing the Ukraine? And the question is particularly about transgender individuals.
Yes. So the answer is yes. And the answer is also, it is very case by case. And that's why there are these channels where people are trying to communicate, which checkpoint are people asking or checking. It's like, I read a story about someone who had to swim through a river. That was very horrifying. You know, what does your document say? How are you being read by the person? It's all of the things that, even if you sometimes feel relatively safe as an LGBT person, I think in a moment like this, in a crisis, like you titled the talk, it's when all of this becomes so real. How is your body being read by this official? Because this individual has the choice of to turn you away or not. So people have definitely been turned away. People have been conscripted. I think pretty much the most horrifying things you can imagine are happening. And I think there are people who are also being able to pass through in different ways, passing as their former gender, you know, or assigned gender. Yeah, there are actually a lot of articles online, so I encourage you to read about it.
Thank you. And if you could perhaps put a link to the organization that you mentioned, the New York City-based organization, that would be great. A question for Professor Slabodsky, partly mine and partly that of a student. You assigned for the students in the class an article which talks about the Azov battalion and about the limitations to thinking of this conflict as perhaps a purely binary conflict between good and evil, between black and white. And the article pointed to the surprising influence of far-right paramilitary organizations in Ukraine. A student asks, in response to the readings, what interests does the Ukrainian state have in supporting right-wing paramilitaries? Surely Zelensky feels a void in his stomach when he gives their soldier medals, says the student.
Okay, so I am not an expert in the Ukraine. I want to acknowledge that. So I look at geopolitical logics and this, but I have been reading, and I would like to know if Sophia has also an input here. But before doing that, what I have collected is the following. Most of the time we think about power as a power in terms of solidarities. And I want to think a little bit about power in terms of interest. What is the interest that the Ukrainian state and these so-called right-wing paramilitaries have in common? When actually you see that, you know, it's very easy to see a difference. You see a Jewish president against the right-wing paramilitaries, and you will say, well, this is a complete disconnect, doesn't make sense. But if they are working together, there is a reason. And I wonder whether or not we can start thinking a little bit about this overlap. And I think the overlap mostly has to do of the development, first of all, of this, what we will call here right-wing, absolutely, nationalism against the Russian invasion, that might have come in some regards in terms of post-Second World War structures where some people favored Nazis, some people favored Russians, some people about the role of nationalism in Eastern Europe that presented itself largely as what we will call in the West reactionary, okay, history. And in this case in particular, I just think that there is one article of Brendan McKeever from Birkbeck in the UK, in which he was talking a little bit about the changes of Jewry in the Ukraine, especially after 1991, and how these changes help us to understand a little bit more the past history, but also the present. So the Jewish role of Zelensky is not the one we think of it in the US itself here. The role of Zelensky is something else. Ukrainian Jews have gone through a transformation, not all of them, not everywhere, that present the possibility for this to happen. So the question is, what will be the common interest? The common interest is in this independence and having the border of the West. If he has Zelensky argument, he will say, well, it's not about Ukraine, it's about the whole Europe, it's about the whole West. Of course, he's doing this strategically because he knows that he needs support in order to stop Russians. But at the same time, I do believe he believes it. It's not that he does this or no, your question seemed to presume perhaps does this despite him. Perhaps he does it because he wants to do it, because there is a common interest. And I think the common interest is to stop the long-standing Russian conception that, that Eastern Europe is their sphere of interest. Why I think that this is something I know very well? Because since 1823, in the Doctrine Monroe in the US, have declared the whole hemisphere that we call today the Americas was the interest of the US. And the US has been invading many Latin American countries with different excuses, from Granada to Panama to supporting the countries in South America. I can think that I know from my experience in Latin America, and very with all the difference, as Sophia said before, things are not completely analogous, but at the same time has to do with these imperial powers declaring a sphere of influences. And as such, the people who are going to fight against them, sometimes they are going to join for common interests with people they might not agree in many things, but in this regard, they need to do it. The anti-imperialist struggle requires a big tent. Sometimes I will completely agree the big tent is a little bit too big. Okay, I just think the big tent high is a little bit too big. But at the same time, because of the inequality of forces, the anti-imperialist struggle require that kind of alliances.
Thank you. And the question of imperialism has been surfacing in the chat, as you may have seen. I know Sophia has already responded to an interesting question about whether Russia can be conceived of as an imperialist state or not. Sophia, you've pointed to Siberia, Georgia, Chechnya, and so forth. Santiago or Sophia, for that matter, would you like to add to that response?
I want to say one thing. I know I just typed it, but I think it kind of ties together what Santiago was just answering in this. Is just these things are not new. You know, so if you look at the Soviet Union was an empire, like Dr. Slabodsky said, and within the Soviet army, there were Jews fighting, right? My grandparents fighting alongside people who conspired with Nazis, right? There were ethnic Ukrainians who were Soviet soldiers who conspired with Nazis. So none of this is new. And I just wanted to say the same thing for the question of empire. But I'm curious what Santiago would say.
No, I would say, no, completely agree. I just think that we need to think about the long term of this. The construction of Russia as an empire, you know, I would just say that at least since the 18th century, Russia has been very, very influenced by Western powers in order to mold itself according to this. So you have from Tsarism to Soviet Union to the current post-Soviet state, in which there is going to be an aspiration, not to mention the level of rhetorics in terms of Moscow as a third Rome, you know, of leading the war of this Orthodox Christianity that actually happened before the Soviet Union, after the Soviet Union, and some people argue that Stalin, or even Stalin, the Soviet Union, nourished itself from these imperialist conceptions in order to advance into his interest. So I just think that calling from the 18th century, probably before then, but at least from the 18th century in the Western sense of an empire, even though it was an empire before, at least from the Western sense of an empire, calling what we call today Russia an empire without thinking about the specificities and the changes will be, for a historian, a little bit too rash. Fair enough. At the same time, at the level of rhetorics and at the level of the people who have suffered the boat of Russia, this has been a continuation. Now, that doesn't mean that the same people fall in the same place in every instance. Okay, Jews have fallen at different places at different times, and sometimes has been more coherent than the other. As Sophia was saying before, there are things that we don't imagine to be. But I also will argue that in the US Army, probably we have some kind of white supremacists and Jews and Afro-Americans also fighting side to side, okay? And Native Americans helping to decode Nazi communication during the Second World War. So so the lines are not easily drawn here. So empires by default are assimilationist. That doesn't mean this assimilationism is going to put everyone in the same level and it's going to be permanent. But to call it Russia not an imperial state, a failed imperial state, present a very Western idea that only the West could achieve it and everyone else should imitate it. And I just think people who have suffered under the Russian vote will disagree with this Western conception of what an empire is or what an empire is not.
Yeah, thank you. It's it's been interesting in my medieval history survey class this semester to teach a class on the Mongols, whose empire, of course, encompassed both proto-Russia and proto-Ukraine. A very different kind of empire in which assimilation was also, and multi-ethnicity was also central. Before we finish, and we're technically out of time, but I would like to allow Melissa's question, Melissa Brownstein, who's mentioned before. Melissa asks, do you think that Russia's labeling of Ukraine as a Nazi country is an attempt by Russia to be perceived as a more civilized culture through this attempt to defend Jewry? Since the US represents the West and is deemed a safe haven for Jews. You can read the question, I think. So any comments from either of you?
You go.
I just love when students of mine ask questions that I can answer myself. And, I all the time, and Melissa is one of them. So thank you, Melissa, for making me think. I will offer an answer to this, but it's going to be very, very imperfect. What I will say is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, we are going to see an emergence of a number of people who became very rich. And these people who became very rich, some of them were Jews. Sometimes they are pointed out as particularly pernicious. It has to do with a global Jewish conspiracy, idea of global Jewish conspiracy, but they have been present. And when you think about the role these people have, I got thinking about someone that people in the UK know very well, Abramovich, because he owns a very, very well-known soccer club there, who is citizen of both Russia and Israel, and also he got very strangely Portuguese citizenship because he declared to be descendant of people who are forced to convert by Catholics in the 16th century. So they are a particular model that will present Russia as connected to the West through other paths that we don't think about. So whether or not these have some influence in terms of trying to present Russia as something different, honestly, I don't know. Right now, unfortunately, I believe global Jewry, because has been normativized through the US and Israel, present itself as Western to the extent that it's impossible to think that Jews were not Western at some point. So if there was an attempt, the attempt is probably going to fail. But if there was an attempt, I think would be very, very interesting to analyze.
Thank you very much indeed. Sophia, or I don't know whether you'd like to jump in.
I'm going to add one sentence, which is I've just been reading a little bit about how these references to Nazis in Ukraine is maybe also Putin's way of kind of bringing attention back to like the glory days of the Soviet Union, which is the Great Patriotic War, as World War II is known there, when the Soviet Union triumphed over, even though in the US it's taught that the Americans won, right? I grew up learning that and my parents had to re-educate me. But that was kind of one of the heights of Soviet power, even as millions and millions of Soviet people were killed. But I think that's also, like Dr. Slabodsky was saying, one of the ways that the Holocaust as part of World War II is being weaponized, in this case, by the Russian state.
So I think it's interesting because the question of Melissa was, is Russia trying to attempt getting help from outside? And I think that what Dr. Sobko is saying, actually, they are trying to unify the inside. It might be both at the same time. I think that might be both at the same time, but I think it's interesting to see how both can be true. So it's a very good point.
Thank you so much for your presentations, both of you, Professor Slabodsky and the soon-to-be Dr. Sobko, as you are now officially known. And thank you all for attending. I wish we could continue. 55 minutes is never enough, but we very much appreciate your time, and thanks to everyone also who attended. I should add that this talk has been recorded thanks to the Hofstra Cultural Center. and will be available for those of you who'd like to go back and check any details or to rewatch it, will be available on Hofstra's YouTube channel within the next few days. Thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of the day.